In the quiet years before the Pacific erupted in war, a man named Isoroku Yamamoto watched America with a soldier's eyes and a mathematician's mind. He studied its rhythm, the endless motion of trains, the sprawling factories that never seemed to rest, the glimmering rivers of oil pipelines stretching across the land like arteries feeding a colossal machine. He had seen industrial power before, in Europe, in Japan. But nothing compared to this. America was vast, not only in size, but in potential. Its people, divided by class and region, still shared a confidence born from abundance. Its factories could shift from automobiles to bombers in the time it took Japan's shipyards to lay a single keel. Yamamoto understood this, as few others did.
He admired American ingenuity, even as he feared what it could become. In the 1920s, as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, he had traveled widely, inspecting universities, industries, and shipyards. He walked through Ford's River Rouge plant, where thousands of men worked in perfect synchronization. Engines emerging from one side, cars rolling out the other. He saw efficiency measured not in hours, but in seconds. And he realized something profound. That in a future war, numbers would matter more than courage. Steel and oil would decide battles long before the first shot was fired. When Yamamoto returned home, his reports warned of what he had seen. He wrote that Japan could never hope to match such production in a prolonged conflict. That even if Japan triumphed early, America's industrial might would grow faster than Japan could destroy it. He described a sleeping giant, not in arrogance, but in awe. He urged caution, diplomacy, and restraint, but Japan was changing. The tides of nationalism were rising, sweeping through the government, through the military, and through the hearts of its people. The empire had already seized Manchuria and was pushing deeper into China. Each victory brought pride and an illusion of invincibility. In the smoke of conquest, the hard arithmetic of industry was forgotten. Yamamoto's voice, once respected, became unwelcome. He was accused of defeatism, of fearing America too much. His warnings were dismissed as pessimism, his caution as weakness. Young officers believed Japan's spirit, its bushido, would overcome any material disadvantage. They believed that courage could substitute for oil, and faith could substitute for steel. But Yamamoto had run the numbers. He knew that faith did not fuel aircraft, and courage did not launch carriers. He had seen the numbers in American ledgers, production figures, resource reserves, population counts, and he knew the truth. If war came, Japan could win battles, but not the war itself. Still, the momentum toward conflict grew unstoppable. By the late 1930s, with sanctions tightening and oil imports threatened, Japan faced a stark choice: retreat or expansion. Diplomacy faltered, militarists gained control, and when war became inevitable, Yamamoto, though opposed to it, was chosen to lead the fleet. He did not want war with America, but he understood his duty. If Japan must fight, he reasoned, then it must strike first, strike hard, and strike in a way that would shock the enemy into negotiation. That logic, ruthless, pragmatic, and cold, became the foundation for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto conceived it not as a path to victory, but as a desperate gamble. He calculated that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. During that time, it might capture enough territory, seize enough resources, and fortify enough defenses to make any American counterattack too costly to pursue. He told his peers, quietly and without emotion, that after 6 months of victories, he could promise nothing. Beyond that, he foresaw defeat. And so, on the morning of December 7, 1941, his plan was set in motion. 6 Japanese carriers steamed silently across the northern Pacific. hidden beneath clouds and radio silence. Their decks carried over 350 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Meticulously trained for one of the most daring naval operations in history. The targets were fixed. The American Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At dawn, as church bells rang across Honolulu, the first wave approached the island. Pilots gripped their controls, the rising sun glinting off their canopies. Below them lay the sleeping harbor, rows of battleships moored in calm water, unaware of the storm about to break. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When it was over, 18 American warships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,000 Americans were dead, and another 1,000 wounded. The battleship Arizona lay in ruins, her crew entombed within her shattered hull. The Oklahoma capsized completely. Smoke rose over the harbor, thick and black, as explosions echoed off the mountains. To the world, it looked like a triumph. Japan had delivered one of the most devastating surprise attacks in military history. Tokyo erupted in celebration. Newspapers declared a divine victory. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. He received the news in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew what others did not yet realize, that the attack had succeeded tactically but failed strategically. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. They were at sea, and they would become the backbone of the American counteroffensive. The oil tanks, the repair yards, the submarine bases, all remained intact. The infrastructure that sustained the Pacific Fleet had survived. America could rebuild quickly. In the days after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's staff celebrated. He did not. Witnesses recalled that he appeared withdrawn, his mood somber. He understood that Japan had achieved shock, not victory. He is said to have murmured, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the sentiment was true. He had spent 20 years warning of this moment, and now it had arrived. Within hours, America's industrial engine began to move. Factories shifted to war production. Men enlisted. Women filled assembly lines. The same nation Yamamoto had admired for its energy now turned that energy toward vengeance. Every plane destroyed at Pearl Harbor would be replaced 100 times over. Every ship sunk would be reborn in steel and smoke within months. The giant was awake. The fires at Pearl Harbor still burned as the first American factories began their transformation. The response was immediate, absolute, and industrial in scale. Congress declared war, the nation mobilized, and across every city, every factory town, every port, America began to move as one enormous machine. In Washington, military planners studied the damage reports and came to the same conclusion Yamamoto had feared. Japan's attack had not crippled American power. It had ignited it. The surviving infrastructure at Pearl Harbor, the oil tanks, the dry docks, the repair depots, meant the Pacific Fleet was not destroyed, merely wounded. Ships that lay half-sunk in December were refloated, repaired, and returned to service within months. By spring, the harbor that had symbolized devastation had become a monument to resilience. Yet, while America rebuilt, Japan advanced. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's prediction played out with chilling precision. Japan seemed unstoppable. Wake Island fell. Guam surrendered. Hong Kong capitulated. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, collapsed under siege. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces fought desperately at Batan and Corregidor before succumbing to hunger, disease, and exhaustion. To the world, it looked as though the rising sun would never set. But beneath Japan's victories, cracks were already forming. Every island captured required fuel. Every ship sent south had to burn precious oil to get there. Every bomber that struck an enemy target consumed resources Japan could not replace. Yamamoto saw it clearly. Japan's reserves of oil and steel were finite. Even with captured fields in the Dutch East Indies, refining and transportation bottlenecks crippled supply. The empire's lifelines stretched thousands of miles across seas, dominated by American submarines that would soon strike back with devastating efficiency. Meanwhile, in the United States, the sleeping giant Yamamoto had warned about was awakening faster than anyone had believed possible. By early 1942, the mobilization was unprecedented in human history. Shipyards on both coasts worked day and night under floodlights that made the sky glow like daylight. New cargo ships were launched every few days, soon every day. From the yards of Kaiser, Bethlehem Steel, and Newport News, factories that once built automobiles now produced tanks and half-tracks. Detroit, once the heart of consumer America, became the arsenal of democracy. In less than a year, the United States transformed its economy entirely into a war machine. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any words. In 1942 alone, America produced 60,000 aircraft, more than Japan would build in the next 3 years combined. By 1943, American shipyards launched more naval tonnage in a single year than Japan launched during the entire war. Assembly lines ran continuously. Engineers and laborers worked 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. Steel poured from furnaces in Pittsburgh and Chicago and flow into the hulls of Liberty ships, destroyers, and carriers. Oil production reached levels that defied belief. Texas and California together produced more oil than the entire Axis powers combined. Pipelines connected fields to refineries and refineries to ports. Tankers moved in endless convoys, escorted by destroyers built faster than the enemy could sink them. Every drop of fuel that Japan burned came from reserves that would never be replenished. Every drop America used could be replaced tenfold. Yamamoto's private fears turned into public truth. The industrial mathematics he had calculated in Washington were becoming reality, one shipment, one convoy, one factory at a time. But Japan did not yet see the scale of the storm gathering against it. Flush with victory, the Japanese army expanded into Burma and New Guinea. Japanese carriers raided the Indian Ocean, sinking British ships and scattering Allied forces. At home, propaganda declared that Japan had achieved dominance over the Pacific. But Yamamoto knew better. He understood that every mile gained cost fuel, and every battle won cost irreplaceable aircraft and trained pilots. He needed one final, decisive blow, a battle that would cripple America before its full industrial might could reach the Pacific. That battle would come at a place few Americans had ever heard of, a tiny coral atoll called Midway. Yamamoto's plan was audacious. He would lure the remaining American carriers into a trap by threatening Midway Island, forcing the U.S. Navy to respond. Then, with overwhelming force, he would annihilate them in a single, decisive engagement. Just as Japan's navy had annihilated the Russians decades earlier at Tsushima, if it worked, Japan could dominate the Pacific for years. If it failed, the empire's fate would be sealed. In June 1942, the fleet set sail. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, advanced under Yamamoto's overall command. Each carried veteran pilots, men who had fought since Pearl Harbor and believed themselves unbeatable. They faced just 3 American carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. The odds, on paper, favored Japan, but Yamamoto did not know that his codes had been broken. American intelligence, working tirelessly in dark, windowless rooms, had deciphered Japan's naval ciphers and identified Midway as the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz set his carriers to ambush Yamamoto's fleet before it could strike. The battle that followed was short, chaotic, and decisive. Within minutes of the first strikes, American dive bombers found their targets. In a single wave of precision attacks, 3 Japanese carriers were set ablaze. Explosions tore through hangars filled with refueling planes and munitions. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air as sailors dove into the sea. By nightfall, all 4 of Yamamoto's carriers were gone. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots were dead. The heart of Japan's offensive power had been destroyed in one afternoon. The Battle of Midway was not just a defeat. It was a turning point. From that moment forward, Japan would fight defensively. The empire's momentum, built on surprise and daring, met the immovable wall of American production and intelligence. The 6 months Yamamoto had predicted were over almost to the day. In Tokyo, disbelief turned to silence. Japan had lost its best carriers, its most experienced aviators, and the strategic initiative. For the first time, Yamamoto's subordinates saw doubt in his face. He had planned brilliantly, executed meticulously, and still failed. Because no amount of strategy could overcome the arithmetic of industry. No plan, however perfect, could outlast a nation that could build a new fleet faster than he could replace a single carrier. The tide of war began to turn. In shipyards from San Francisco to Philadelphia, new carriers slid down their launchways. By the end of 1943, America had more carriers at sea than Japan had built in its entire history. Factories that once made household goods now produced engines, bombs, and bullets. America's industrial output did not just recover from Pearl Harbor, it exploded far beyond what anyone, even Yamamoto, had imagined. By then, the Admiral knew the truth. The war he had tried to prevent, the war he had been forced to fight, was now unwinnable. He had seen it in 1925, calculated it in 1935, and lived it in 1942. Japan had awakened the giant, and now the giant was marching. By early 1943, the balance in the Pacific had shifted completely. What had once been an ocean dominated by the Imperial Japanese Navy was now turning into a vast battlefield of attrition, one Japan could never hope to sustain. The Americans were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for momentum. And that momentum was now unstoppable. Yamamoto, though outwardly calm and composed, understood this more than anyone. He knew the Pacific was now a numbers game, one that Japan had already lost. The U.S. Navy could replace every sunk carrier, every lost pilot, every burned-out plane, faster than Japan could build a single replacement. Every battle from now on, no matter how bravely fought, would drain Japan's strength while America grew stronger. But duty bound him to continue. He had planned the war, he had led his men into it. Now, even as his private doubts deepened, he could not, abandon them. He still believed that decisive leadership could at least delay the inevitable. He wanted to buy time for Japan to fortify its new defensive perimeter, time for the empire to negotiate a peace on better terms. That meant Yamamoto had to fight again, and his next campaign would take him deep into the Solomon Islands, to the jungles of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was brutal in every sense. It was a place of heat, disease, and constant death. The Americans had landed there in August 1942, capturing an airstrip the Japanese had begun to build. That airstrip, Henderson Field, would become the most fiercely contested piece of ground in the Pacific. Whoever controlled it would control the skies over the Solomon Islands, and with them, the sea routes between Japan and its southern empire. The battles around Guadalcanal became a test of endurance. Naval engagements flared in the darkness of night, where ships traded salvos at point-blank range. Pilots fought above the steaming jungle canopy, while exhausted infantry clashed in mud and rain below. Every day, both sides suffered. Every day, the Japanese tried to reinforce their positions. But as the months dragged on, it became clear. The Americans could resupply faster, fly more sorties, replace more men. For Japan, the battle was a slow, grinding bleed. Yamamoto's strategy shifted. He ordered a series of air operations from the fortress at Rabaul, attempting to crush American air power and reclaim the initiative. But each attack cost planes and pilots Japan could never replace. The Americans, meanwhile, learned. Their tactics improved. Their coordination sharpened. What Japan had once held as an advantage in training and experience was now slipping away. Young Japanese pilots, barely trained, went into combat against seasoned American veterans. The skies that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to the enemy. By February 1943, Yamamoto faced the grim reality he had foreseen a decade earlier. Japan was being pushed back, one island at a time. The industrial miracle of America was now an avalanche. New ships, new aircraft, new weapons, all pouring from assembly lines that seemed to stretch endlessly across the continent. In contrast, Japan's factories struggled just to keep up with the losses. Fuel was scarce, steel was rationed, and every shipment from the southern resource zone came at the cost of lives and ships lost to American submarines. And yet, Yamamoto still fought, not out of hope, but out of honor. He believed that Japan's soldiers, sailors, and airmen deserved his presence, his leadership, and his courage. So in April 1943, he made a fateful decision, one that would cost him his life. On April 14th, American codebreakers intercepted a radio message. It contained details of Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands, his exact itinerary, flight paths, and times. The Americans immediately recognized the opportunity. Operation Vengeance was born. On the morning of April 18, 1943, Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber at Rabaul. He was calm, composed, dressed immaculately as always. He carried no illusions about the war's direction, but he was determined to see his men. As his aircraft lifted off, a squadron of American P-38 Lightning fighters was already in the air, having flown a daring 400-mile low-level approach to intercept him. At 9:34 a.m., over the jungles of Bougainville, they spotted the formation. The P-38s climbed, engaged, and in a matter of minutes, the sky was filled with tracer fire. Yamamoto's bomber was hit, one engine trailing smoke. It rolled, descended, and vanished into the trees below. The wreckage was found hours later. Inside, the admiral lay still in his seat, his sword at his side, his white-gloved hand resting on his pistol. He had been killed instantly. When the news reached Tokyo, it was met with stunned silence. The man who had planned the Pearl Harbor strike, who had commanded Japan's navy at its height, was gone. The empire had lost not only a commander, but a symbol. A man of intellect, discipline, and reluctant war. For his men, it was more than a death. It was the end of an era. But Yamamoto's death
did not change the course of the war. It only accelerated what was already inevitable. By 1944, American power dominated the Pacific. Carrier groups roamed freely, striking island after island. Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, each fell in turn. Japan's once mighty navy was decimated at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where hundreds of Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day. The battle was so one-sided that American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was the final confirmation of what Yamamoto had always known. Japan could not win against American industry.
By 1945, Japanese cities were burning under relentless bombing raids. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya all turned to ash. Factories that once built war machines were rubble. Trains stopped. Ships rusted in port. The war Yamamoto had never wanted had consumed everything. And as atomic fire fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, his old prediction echoed once again, not as a warning, but as prophecy fulfilled. I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant, and fill him with a terrible resolve. In the aftermath, historians would argue about Yamamoto's legacy. Was he a genius strategist or a tragic realist trapped by politics? A patriot who tried to prevent war, or the man who delivered its most infamous blow? The truth lies somewhere between those extremes. He was a man who understood the power of industry, the mathematics of modern warfare, and the inevitability of destruction once the engines of production began to turn. He fought not because he believed Japan could win, but because he believed he must honor those who served under him. His life remains a study in contrasts, intellect and obedience, foresight and fatalism, brilliance and inevitability. And in many ways, his story is the story of Japan itself during the Second World War. Bold, tragic, and ultimately doomed by forces larger than any one man. The sleeping giant he feared did awaken, and once awakened, it reshaped the world. War is often remembered by its battles, by maps, victories, and losses. But the real story is in the choices made before the first shot is fired. Isoroku Yamamoto understood that war with America was suicide. He warned it, calculated it, and lived to see it unfold exactly as he had feared. His brilliance could not save Japan from its own destiny, a lesson that echoes across every war that followed. If this story moved you, and you want to explore more of these forgotten human moments behind history's most devastating conflicts, subscribe, stay with us, and step deeper into the hidden corners of World War II. Because behind every statistic, every victory, and every defeat, there is a story worth telling. And we'll keep uncovering them, one at a time. Watch next, our deep dive into the forgotten battle for the Atlantic, where silent hunters beneath the waves decided the fate of continents. Or explore the men who turned desperation into precision, the 50-yard doctrine, a story of courage, fear, and tactical genius. Every click, every view keeps history alive and ensures that the lessons written in fire are never forgotten.